meditations of our hearts, in the actions of our lives, may your word be proclaimed. Amen. Richard Daley. Richard Daley. I was 13. My best friend Brian was 15. We'd gone over to the local corner store together to buy some pop so we could hang out in the park. Remember those corner stores? The penny candy was right in open boxes on the front shelves, right? The fridges that chilled the pop were always really noisy. The places kind of smelled like cardboard all the time. And the floors creaked. Remember those stores? Getting pop to take to the park was a regular thing for Brian and me. We'd just hang out there and just talk. Only this time, Richard Daley was standing on the corner. I knew Richard in grade 7. He was in my grade 7 class, and we kind of got along. But then he moved away for grade 8, and I never saw him again until this day. He called us over before we went into the store to buy a pop. Felt innocuous enough, felt safe, I thought he was being friendly, so we went over. But it wasn't safe. He wasn't being friendly. Before long, Brian and I were being teased, ridiculed, forcibly held and slapped around a bit, forced to smoke cigarettes. We were called lots of really awful names. We were forced on all fours, while each of these guys took turns riding us like donkeys. Pretty tame as far as bully behavior goes, but it was a horrifying experience for me and for Brian. When it was over, we had more than bruised and bleeding knees. Brian and I nursed that emotional injury for weeks. We avoided the store for the rest of the summer. Well, except the time that my mom, late in the summer, asked me to go run an errand for her at the store. No one ever said no to my mother. And so off to the corner store I went, hoping, nervous. And sure enough, there was Richard Daley and his buddies again. I ran into the store this time, pretending like nothing was wrong. When I came out, they called me over again, but I turned and ran. One of his buddies followed, but for the first time in my life, I outran someone. I ran 3 blocks to the busy street, crossed it without looking, and ran down the next back alley till I reached the first gate I trusted. It was our next door neighbor. The kid kept chasing me until I hit that gate, and then he turned around. And I ran right into the kitchen. My mother happened to be there at the time. I was out of breath, and I handed her the cigarettes she asked me to get for her. She wondered why I was panting. Letting the fear, and the pride, and the shame just live quietly within me. I said, oh, I just wanted to try running home. Pretty tame as far as bully behavior is concerned. But it was horrifying. From that day to this, I have never told that story to anyone. Brian is the only one who knows it happened. And from that day to this, I just have to think about Richard Daley, and that ordeal comes up like a bad dream. In fact, I still have dreams where I'm being chased by someone and I'm not able to use my voice to scream for help. Richard Daley. That event remains a touchstone in my life, a marker, a kairos moment that forever altered my experience of those times when I feel voiceless and powerless. I wonder if there are other Richard Daley stories here this morning. I'm hunching there are others who have a Bathsheba story. This is a story about a rape and a cover-up perpetrated by someone in an ultimate position of power. It's despicable. It's heinous. And we wonder, why is David touted as Israel's greatest king? So far, he seems to be nothing but a creep. Yeah? There are a few things I'd like you to notice as we approach this story this morning. Remember last week we heard that David would be given rest from all of his enemies? Remember we read that? Well, this story opens with the words, this is the season, the spring season when kings go to war. David was supposed to have his rest from his enemies, but this story suggests that that's the farthest thing from the truth. David has turned war into sport, and it happens every spring. And did you notice that kings should be out in front with their soldiers? David's lying at home, on his couch, in the middle of the afternoon. What's with that? And do you remember weeks ago when we were beginning to explore this agrarian society becoming a monarchy? And all of the tribal leaders came to Samuel and said, we want a king. What we're doing now, is it working? And we want a king. And so Samuel hears from God, and God says, kings will take your sons and put them to war. Kings will take your daughters and make them cooks and handmaidens. This is the very same word that's used in this story as in that story before. Takes. David takes Bathsheba. That's the same word as was used when we read it a number of weeks ago. David took Bathsheba. The people shouldn't be surprised. This is what kings did, right? And God predicted it. Even Uriah, the Hittite, behaves better, doesn't he? Rather than find some respite in the arms of his wife after David brings him home from the battlefield to cover up a pregnancy, he says, how can I do that when my men are fighting? So he doesn't. He stayed with the soldiers and the slaves of the king who were holed up at the palace. Did you notice that in 15 verses, there seems to be a complete absence of God? There's no prophet in this story. Stan did not use the word God. There was no even a conscience. There was no kind of moral, sober second thought. There's not an internal moral code that might have come from some kind of divine thing. God seems to be absent from these 15 verses. Clearly, David is not remembering the covenant. This isn't even a crime of passion and forbidden love where two lovers can't be together. The sex act and the consequences of it are described in 3 short sentences, in 2 verses. David is a collector of women, and this is just one trophy he wants. Except for Uriah's response. This botched cover-up and the intent to murder are the bulk of the story. And David had accomplices. Joab and those who took Bathsheba from her home. The king had power, and he used it. It was calculated and intentional. And I wonder what it must have been like for Bathsheba. What's troubling about all of this morning is not Bathsheba's experience, as awful as that must have been, or as difficult as it may be for you to hear me say that. The troubling part, for me, is how quickly I can move to harsh judgment about David, forgetting how even more quickly I have the capacity, I think we all have the capacity, to be just as abusive, especially in the wake of feeling voiceless and powerless. We vilify the bully, but how quickly would we want to return the abuse? Retaliation, retribution, in greater measure, isn't far behind. What's also troubling about this story is to realize how we have been and continue to be brainwashed into thinking this kind of coercive power leads to any kind of permanent solution. Witness Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. Witness Desert Storm and 9/11. When I was in New York City 2 years ago on my birthday, seeing the July 4th fireworks from the Hudson River, it was spectacular. But on our way, we had to pass through police checks. They were stanchions and police checks. They were checking for guns. We joked about it, saying, they're checking for guns. If you don't have one, they'll lend one to you. And we laugh. Isn't it absurd? We live in a culture of coercive power, and sometimes we're not even conscious of it. These are the days when God seems absent, like the 15 verses that Stan just read. In those moments when we are victims of the abuse of coercive power, most especially when we are perpetrators of the abuse of coercive power, it feels like God's absent. Mostly, I think God cries. Mostly, when humans don't live up to the covenant, even God needs time to recover. To recover from that acute pain of seeing this glorious creation behave outside of the covenant. It took 3 days for the son to be raised. But raised he was. In the face of great suffering, he was raised. On the days when God seemed so far away, on those days, that's all we've got. He was raised in 3 days. Thank God. Amen. Please pray with me. Holy One, in story, incredible story, you come and remind us that leadership includes the temptation of abuse of power. It doesn't look nice. It certainly doesn't feel nice. And reminded we are. We know there's a story next week that turns this, and you do see it, and we know that. And today, it doesn't feel nice. So we're grateful that we know he was raised in 3 days, Hope is what you do when it feels hopeless. So we give you thanks that we can hope. This is our prayer. In the name of the one who was raised